Okay, excellent. So this is this project has been slightly retitled "The Marriage Market: Effects of Strengthening Female Inheritance Rights in Pakistan," Field and Jeremy Lebeau at Duke. So the motivation for this project is to try to understand what happens when the state forces households to divide inheritance between daughters and sons. So there's a pretty big body of evidence that assets and property ownership for women are associated with improved economic, demographic, and health outcomes. But if the state forces parents to increase bequests to daughters relative to what they would do in the absence of any intervention, that might lead parents to reallocate away from other investments in their daughters or change how they behave on the marriage market. So for example, it might shift their preference over grooms in an arranged marriage market to prevent the fragmentation of their property or to maximize the marriage market value of their bequest. So this is more generally linked into, I think, this idea that marriage markets may potentially undo or partially undo some of the benefits or the effects of programs or laws that are put into place to benefit or empower women. So I'm going to just briefly kind of sketch out why we think that might be the case. It's a very sketchy conceptual framework, but just to kind of motivate what we think might be going on in the context of a case in which the state kind of sets parameters over how daughters and sons inheritance, how inheritance is divided between daughters and sons, and then I'll talk about what we're doing empirically in this setting. So you can imagine that parents might have, they start out with wealth that they're expecting to go forward when they die in the form of inheritance. They might have a preference about how their wealth is going to be divided between children. But they also, during their lifetime, are going to make transfers to their children, right? Including various different things, but in particular here, we're interested in human capital in the form of education and in the context of a dowry type marriage market, as we see in South Asia, in the form of dowry. So we can think about that also as a transfer during their lifetime that helps them get a better quality spouse. So it's a transfer that precedes the bequest. So they take how much wealth they have, take out whatever they're going to spend on the education and the dowry, and then what's left is what's divided between the children when they die. In the context of a sort of contested inheritance system, daughters have to such as we see in a lot of South Asian contexts, including Pakistan, daughters have to contest in order to obtain their share of inheritance, and there might be some uncertainty about whether they can get that. And reform, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, could increase the probability that the daughter actually gets her share. So the key thing here is that once the parents are aware of this change, that the fact that there's a higher probability the daughter is going to get her inheritance, they may re-optimize by reducing how much they invest in daughters, in the sense of reducing their investments in education, reducing the investment in dowry, and ultimately that could result in getting a lower quality spouse. So the daughter is going to then gain, if she's successful in contesting her inheritance, she is going to gain the wealth in the form of inheritance when her father passes away, but she is not in a position up front to commit that she's not going to contest to it. So even if she might want to say up front to her parents, you know, I just go ahead and invest it in my dowry. I won't ask for the inheritance later, but there's no way really that she can promise credibly that she won't do that. So they're concerned about that risk, and so they can't necessarily trade that off and invest upfront in the human capital or in the dowry, and anticipating that she won't do this because there's no way she can commit not to. So in this kind of a setup, if there's a reform that forces parents to bequest to daughters, then we should expect to see a number of different things happening. The first is that dowry should fall because the bride is now bringing potentially her bequest wealth into the marriage. So it's a substitution between inheritance and dowry. However, for the grooms, the market value on the marriage market of that bequest is potentially lower than the same amount of money in dowry for a couple of reasons. One is that in the dowry could be effectively more easily appropriated by the groom, or it just goes directly to the groom and his family in the first place, whereas a woman who inherits some property might retain control over that property. Secondly, there's a huge issue of uncertainty in timing. So at the time of marriage, if the father-in-law, the bride's father is still alive, he doesn't know when the father-in-law is going to pass away, obviously. He also faces some uncertainty about whether the bride is actually going to successfully receive her share. And so there's the parents are sort of having to accept that they would have to give this away in the form of the bequest, but the groom faces all of these sources of uncertainty about whether he can effectively control the resources, and so it may actually end up being less valuable to him. So that suggests that the cost of groom quality would rise in terms of the total amount of bequest plus dowry that the parents have to give the daughter. And if the amount of sort of inheritable property, in this case, we're going to be looking at land, is high enough, then parents may reduce their investment in human capital pre-bequest. So ultimately, this can lead to lower schooling, lower age at marriage, and lower investment in husband quality. So we should see a strong negative effect on the dowries paid, potentially a negative effect on schooling and age of marriage. The effects on husband quality are ambiguous because she brings resources into the marriage, but then they're less valuable than the cash dowry, as I just argued. And so ultimately, how wealthy of a household she's going to live in as an adult is ambiguous. So there's this positive effect from the wealth that she receives after her father passes away, but then there's also these negative effects. So what we're trying to sort of show here is that there's overall a very ambiguous net effect of strength on women's well-being, of strengthening property rights for women at inheritance. Even overall, it's not clear whether it's going to be positive or negative given these countervailing effects. Okay, so I've set up kind of why we think that that strengthening the inheritance rights might have these sort of complicated and countervailing effects. What are we actually doing to look at this empirically? So in Pakistan, under the Shariat Muslim personal law, the law sets fixed shares for each legal heir, and legally daughters have to receive a share. This is a common feature of all Islamic legal systems. But female disinheritance is extremely common. So in the data, one of the data sets that we're looking at here of women whose fathers or husbands owned property and died over this decade from 2000 to 2010, only 22% report that they inherited anything. So there's a huge gap between the law and the de facto practice. Where does that gap come in? Well, just to kind of big picture, what happens in the inheritance process is two steps. The first is verifying who is actually an heir. And the second is then separating them and transferring the estate according to the shares that are set out in the law. So we think that this step of verifying who's an heir is where there's a lot of potential loopholes that are coming up and what this reform aimed to address. What happened is that the provincial government and the World Bank did this larger reform aimed at modernizing the land record and transaction system by digitizing manual land records and providing land record service centers. And that is going to remove a lot of loopholes in that verification process. Just to give you an idea of what this looks like, before the reform, all the land records are manually maintained by Badwaris with local officers with manual transactions. One heir can complete the entire process manually. His sisters don't have to be present. So he can show up and say, you know, I only have brothers, I don't have any sisters, or just list who is supposed to be on the list of heirs. Post-reform, it's all digitized, centralized, and there's also a big effort in the program to make it more accessible to women with female staff. And crucially, there's also biometric verification of the identity of all the heirs. So this removes a lot of those potential loopholes for brothers to essentially not list their sisters at this point. This program was rolled out at the tehsil or sub-district level over a period of several years, and that start is largely uncorrelated with district-specific characteristics. So we're going to use a whole bunch of different secondary data sets. I'm not going to go into all of them, but just to give you an idea that this project involves sort of pulling together data from multiple different household surveys, each of which is going to provide us different kind of set of outcomes that we're interested in looking at here. So I'm going to skip this in the interest of time and just say that essentially we're using a couple of different strategies for identification here to look at the impact on inheritance first and kind of immediate effect of the reform on inheritance, we're going to be using a combination of the rollout of the program and the timing of the death of the father of the woman who's surveyed. So the identifying assumption is that the interaction of the death timing and the program timing in an individual family is not correlated with changes in inheritance rights over time by subdistrict. In some of the outcomes where we're looking at anticipation effects as opposed to effects of actually experiencing the inheritance, we're going to use a more standard sort of rollout type of difference design. Okay. So the first result is that this reform did dramatically increase the probability of daughters inheriting. In the control group where this reform hasn't yet happened, about 13%, these are all women whose fathers owned property, owned some sort of land. So about 13% in the control group say that they inherited some of the land and kept it, and that goes up by 8 percentage points in response, 8 to 9 percentage points in response to this new system. So it's a pretty dramatic increase. We see, consistent with the sketch that I laid out at the beginning, that dowries fall over the period of the program rollout for landowning households. So overall, they're increasing over this, alongside this reform. But if you look specifically at the landowning households relative to non-landowning households, we see a drop in dowry, which is consistent with this idea that there's a trade-off between dowry and inheritance. So you're going to get land when I die, so I don't need to give you a huge dowry at the time you get married. And then going along with that, what we see is that treated women whose father's death occurs after the reform happens in their area get married younger. They're more likely to be married by age 18. They're more likely to get married without choice about getting married or consent to the choice of spouse. They're more likely to get married to husbands who are significantly older than they are, and they're more likely to get married to lower quality spouses. So husbands who don't have a secondary education and husbands who have incomes below the median in the sample. They're also more likely to have children younger. For women who get married, so women who get married after the reform also experience an increase in husbands controlling behavior. And this is not true. We don't see a similar effect for women who were already married before the reform, which suggests that what's happening here is related to spousal quality as opposed to something else that's going on. We use a couple of different data sets to confirm this result on marriage without an increase in marriage without consent, and it looks similar across different data sets. There's been other research on inheritance kind of looking at consanguinity, so cousin marriage or marriage to relatives as a response to these two changes in inheritance rules, and we find that our results are not driven by consanguinity. And then the final set of results I want to talk about here is related to human capital. So I motivated this at the beginning by saying that there could be a disinvestment in human capital that compensates for the increase in anticipated inheritance. So what we're doing here is we're going to use variation in children's gender composition combined with the Islamic inheritance formula to construct how much of the estate each child stands to gain or lose. So there's a strict formula as far as how land is divided between daughters and sons. And we use that formula to say, okay, if you're a daughter, how much do you stand to gain if you had 3 brothers and 1 sister versus if you had, 1 brother and 2 sisters and so forth. So we construct this share, and we're going to use that as an interaction with our rollout. So what we see is that for landed household, kids.
Just wanted to highlight, you have about a minute left.
Awesome, thank you. I'm nearly done.
Okay.
So kids in households that are land owning who stand to gain, so daughters specifically, sorry, this table is just looking at daughters. Daughters in land owning households who stand to gain more from the switch to female inheritance are less likely to, they're basically completing less education over when the reform has taken place in their location. So just to wrap up, what we find is that this land records digitization very substantially increased women's likelihood of inheriting land. That's also my timer just telling me that it's time. But it did lead to unanticipated negative consequences as parents, reduced investment in daughters, leading to lower educational attainment and worse marriage outcomes. And so I think the broader lesson that we take away from this is that policies that attempt to improve gender outcomes by forcing reallocation of a fixed pool of resources, so land is a fixed amount. This reform isn't changing the amount of land that's there. It's saying, here's how you have to divide it between your daughters and your sons, may face inherent challenges as families re-optimize in response. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and in advance for any comments and questions. We gratefully acknowledge funding from the EDI initiative and NDER digitization initiative, as well as research assistance from Hassan Mahmoud, Mehroz Heather, and Maniha Aftab.